Justin Trudeau has put a 25% tariff on the Chinese imports. This is the tariff on China's steel and aluminium imports to Canada.
Would you describe Xi Jinping as a dictator?
Look, China's a one-party state. I don't think anyone would call it a democracy. We can get into all sorts of different definitions. The fact is, he's not running a democracy. It's an authoritarian state.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has positioned himself as a loyal advocate for human rights, democracy, and international justice. His administration has been vocal in criticizing authoritarian regimes and highlighting the importance of upholding international norms. In particular, Trudeau's condemnation of China's human rights record, especially concerning the treatment of the Uyghur and Tibetan populations, has become a defining feature of his leadership on the global stage. As we move forward, I'd like to ask you a quick favor to subscribe and like this video. It takes just a second and helps so much.
I think the world is divided politically. I think citizens around the world are facing the same kinds of challenges. Worry about being able to put food on the table for their families, whether you're in an extremely rich country like Canada or a really challenging emerging economy somewhere in the global south. There are pressures on families around what kind of jobs they're going to be able to do in a shifting economy. What are the impacts of climate change on their agriculture, on their home communities? How is the world changing in so many different ways is affecting citizens directly. So having frank conversations about where we can be there to invest. I've been speaking a bit about nuclear over the past days, and I'll have another intervention on that this morning, how important it is to be able to provide power, electricity cleanly to people in vulnerable parts of the world in really, really concrete ways. Canada is a source of solutions, and we're there for investments, whether it's with our pension funds, whether it's directly with government investments, or whether it's Canadian investors or global investors looking to contribute to well-being of people around the world. The impact of China and Russia and others showing up as well. Sometimes is positive, sometimes comes with strings attached. But I think the fact that the entire world is looking at how we're going to solve the challenges faced by citizens to reassure them that the future is bright, even though it doesn't always feel that way these days, is going to be really important.
Although Trudeau's statements leave no doubts, there are growing concerns about the perceived contradictions between his moral assertions and the practicality of his diplomatic actions. Critics argue that Canada's confrontational stance on human rights, while admirable in principle, often fails to translate into effective foreign policy outcomes. Canada's attempts to challenge China on these issues have, in many instances, been met with retaliation. Trudeau's government has been vocal in condemning China's policies towards the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang and the ongoing restrictions in Tibet, framing these as significant human rights violations that Canada cannot ignore.
But there are also areas in which we're going to have to directly challenge China, whether it's on human rights, whether it's on security behaviors, whether it's on cyber attacks or concerns like that. We're going to have to continue to be wide-eyed and clear about the threat that China poses and wants to pose to the stability of our democracies.
However, this moral stance has led to increasing tensions between the two nations. While Canada champions human rights, China's economic power and political influence present a challenge for Trudeau's government. China, as one of the world's largest economies, plays a major role in global trade and investment, and its relationship with Canada is necessary for maintaining the country's economic stability. This creates a difficult balancing act for Trudeau as he tries to maintain Canada's commitment to human rights, while not abandoning a key economic partner. The challenge becomes even worse as China has made it clear that it will retaliate against any nation that openly criticizes its policies. Canada has experienced diplomatic consequences in the form of trade restrictions and the detention of Canadian citizens, especially in the case of the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. On a global scale, Canada's foreign policy under Trudeau has been met with mixed reactions. While the country is praised for its strong stance on human rights, many critics argue that the overall strategic direction of Canada's diplomacy remains unclear. As China's global influence continues to expand both economically and politically, it has become less prone to align with the moralistic criticisms coming from smaller nations like Canada. When Canada criticizes China's human rights record, China dismisses these criticisms as insignificant, seeing them as a nuisance rather than a legitimate threat. Trudeau's foreign policy on China reveals a big difference between Canada's moral high ground and the harsh practicalities of realpolitik. While the Prime Minister has consistently framed his actions as a commitment to global justice, peace, and human rights, his claims have often come into conflict with the need for peaceful diplomatic relations in a world where economic considerations often carry more weight than ideologies. Canada, as a middle power with significant trade dependencies, particularly with China, faces a problem: how to navigate the tension between moral action and the need for China's cooperation in areas like trade, security, and climate change. A growing body of critics has raised the question: is Prime Minister Trudeau's foreign policy genuinely driven by a commitment to global justice, or is it merely a series of gestures to secure political capital on the international stage? On one hand, Trudeau has consistently framed his actions as a defense of human rights and international norms, which are principles that align with Canadian values. Yet, the actions taken by his government often lack meaningful results. Critics of Trudeau's foreign policy also claim that his confrontational approach to China is a convenient distraction from pressing domestic and economic concerns. By focusing attention on high-profile international clashes, such as condemning China's human rights record or engaging in diplomatic standoffs, Trudeau may be attempting to redirect the public's gaze away from more immediate and complex domestic problems. The absence of a clear, strategic vision has raised concerns about the effectiveness of Canada's diplomatic approach. Critics argue that Trudeau's foreign policy is more focused on presenting a moral narrative rather than calculating the diplomatic risks involved in such high-profile confrontations. The lack of a long-term strategy means that Canada's foreign relations, particularly with China, could be characterized by an overemphasis on symbolism rather than the tangible policy shifts necessary to effect change. The evolving partnership between China and Russia makes things more complex. This alignment of two major powers challenges Western democracies and underestimates the stability of traditional alliances. For Canada, a founding member of NATO and an advocate for liberal democratic values, navigating these shifting alliances can get risky. One of the most immediate consequences of Trudeau's strained relations with China is the potential for economic fallout. As one of Canada's largest trading partners, China holds considerable sway over sectors like agriculture, technology, and natural resources. Deteriorating diplomatic ties could lead to reduced trade opportunities, decreased investments, and retaliatory measures from Beijing. This economic vulnerability is particularly concerning given Canada's reliance on exports to maintain economic stability. By prioritizing moral posturing over peaceful engagement, Trudeau's government risks creating ripple effects that could harm Canadian businesses and workers, worsening challenges like inflation and unemployment, further straining the domestic economy. Another paradox of Justin Trudeau's foreign policy lies in his attempt to promote a moral and principled stance while navigating a global environment shaped, in part, by the very policies and decisions of his administration. Trudeau has positioned Canada as a champion of human rights and justice, frequently calling out countries like China for their perceived violations. However, this advocacy exists alongside decisions and actions that reveal the complexity and, at times, contradiction of such a standpoint. Adding to this is the irony of Trudeau urging Canadians to tread cautiously in a volatile global landscape, while his own government engages in high-stakes confrontations with powerful nations like China. These confrontations often lack tangible outcomes, leaving Canada in a vulnerable position. For example, while Trudeau criticizes China's human rights record, his government has struggled to address pressing domestic issues such as Indigenous rights and systemic inequalities within Canada. Trudeau's efforts to lead with principles have yet to produce significant changes in the behavior of nations like China, raising doubts about the real impact of his approach. This struggle between high ideals and practical needs highlights the irony and contradictions in Trudeau's approach to diplomacy, putting Canada at a turning point in its role on the world stage. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.